How did one hero save 1 billion lives? He's been called the greatest human being who's ever lived, and a journalist described him as, aside from Kissinger, probably the biggest killer of all to have got the Nobel Peace Prize. If the US, Brazil, Russia, Mexico, and Japan disappeared overnight, it would have less of an effect on global population than if this guy was never born. He's also been credited with poisoning the soil that our food grows on, risking a global famine that could one day starve even you and I. This is the story behind the question, how did the man who fed the world become hated by so many people? Norman Borlaug was born on his grandfather's farmhouse in Iowa, 1914, where he was raised. The farm was their only source of food. They rarely, if ever, produced enough to trade. A bad year meant going hungry. On the farm, there was nothing mechanical in sight. Everything was done with muscle. Equipment was powered by horses. Harvestation and irrigation were done by hand. Electricity was a distant myth. Their first tractor didn't come until Borlaug was already 15. But to slow was to starve. The fear of going hungry chased the family into perpetual labor. Yet, even in a world where one fewer pair of hands could be the difference between a successful yield and one that spelled doom, Borlaug's family pushed him to get an education. His grandfather in particular pushed him to go. Norman was described as his grandfather's shadow. He'd follow him around and do what he did and absorb what he said. As they fed the chickens and pulled the weeds, his grandfather, who called him Normboy, would spur him towards growth. He would say things like, do good deeds and think for yourself, and famously, fill your head now to fill your belly later. But if he did go off to school, his family would lose the aid of their only son. The farm's yearly yield meant the difference between life and death. How could he leave them behind? But his grandfather persisted. He would tell Borlaug what it means to be a good man. Ideas like, success is to help the people who need it, not those who don't, eventually accumulated into the belief that an education could help him do what he had to do, to be who he had to be. His family would say that maybe with an education he could come back and lift some of the burden off of their shoulders. Maybe he could fill their bellies too. By 19, he'd decided he was going to attend the University of Minnesota. He'd saved a grand total of $50 for college. His grandfather pitched in with $11 more, and his dad offered to match the $61, but Norman refused. He told his dad that he wanted him to save the money so that his sisters could get an education too. Which begs the question, how did such a kind child from such an honest background come to have such a controversial legacy? Borlaug's experience in college was rigorous, but not necessarily bad. He found jobs on campus to stay afloat, like at the local coffee shop, or honoring his forestry major at the entomology lab to fight tree disease. At the coffee shop, he met a woman named Margaret Gibson. Borlaug was shy. He was blown away that someone like her would even talk to him at all. To the tree that is Borlaug's life, Margaret would become a perpetual source of sunlight. She would nourish him and encourage him to grow beyond all comfort, to become a source of life to the ecosystem around him. They'd get married soon. But the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression had begun. Borlaug watched as his neighbors lost their farms from extreme crop failure. He watched his family on the precipice of starvation while he could barely feed himself. He would work often for breakfast rather than money, and then starve for the rest of the day. He would hear about the milk strikes that were going on, where farmers would dump away their milk in a desperate attempt to raise its prices. He would hear about the deaths that came from the milk strikes as he himself was teetering on the point of bankruptcy. While the world was on fire, he had a thought that, little did he know, would govern the direction of his life. He thought that if we just applied the technology we had, we wouldn't have to go hungry. He graduated in 1937, but after his promise of a job at the US Forest Service fell through, he went back to school and sought one with a man named Professor Stackman. He became his assistant, and for the next 5 years, he worked and continued his studies until he eventually got his doctorate in plant pathology. He then went to work as a microbiologist for 2 years. The uncertainty that loomed over his entire life as a youth had finally begun to ease, but famine and war still choked the world as World War II raged on. In 1944, Stackman approached Borlaug with an invitation to join him on the Rockefeller Foundation's Mexican Project. The Mexican Project's goal was simple: feed Mexico. The Great Depression and the Dust Bowl ended years earlier, and America was booming back to prosperity. But Mexico's agriculture still suffered. Stem rust disease killed off so much wheat that Mexico had less than half of what it needed to feed itself. Farmers lacked training and basic equipment. Amongst the poor, everyone was hungry, and almost everyone was poor. Borlaug himself was no stranger to the suffering of hunger. He knew that leaving the Mexican people behind would be to leave them to starve. But at the same time, not even the word abysmal could describe the conditions he'd be working in if he went. He'd be sleeping in huts without electricity or running water. He'd be operating rusty equipment with an untrained team. He'd have to assemble the machines he'd need from parts he could find lying around his decaying lab. It'd be remote, lonely in an unfamiliar and uncomforting land, far disconnected from the life he knew. All the while, he'd be endeavoring to conquer a disease that scores of researchers had failed to. It'd be like leaving home to go to war with the Roman Empire armed with a stick. But the villain of starvation must be defeated no matter where it was. He remembered what his grandfather would teach him, that success is to help the people who need it, not the people who don't. He knew that Mexico needed it, so he made up his mind. He was going. But how did such a heroic endeavor become so controversial? In 1944, Borlaug arrived in the Yaqui Valley in Mexico. It was beautiful. His first impression was steadfast. He thought, what the hell have I gotten myself into? He saw farmers who survived by eating the food they grew, growing no food. The farmers themselves were untrained. One farmer let Borlaug plow his land, but when he saw that Borlaug's plow was made out of steel, he begged him to stop. He told him that the steel plow was going to take the warmth out of the land and that it was going to render it infertile. Borlaug insisted that that wasn't going to happen, but the farmer was so worried that after Borlaug left, he brought cows onto the field to put heat back into the land. But Borlaug and his team were there to help, and the locals knew it. Researchers had come before, and though they weren't successful, they at least had good intentions. So the locals gave Borlaug and his team affectionate nicknames. They called them social parasites. The enemy was stem rust disease. To combat it, it made sense to follow the agricultural conventions that said, the taller, the better. The bigger the plant, the bigger the yield, and Borlaug and his team understood this, so they bred it with a dwarf. Yes, they shrunk it. Why? Well, they had earlier success in growing a crop that produced higher yields, but when the grain heads got heavier, the plant would collapse on itself. So they bred their new wheat with a Japanese dwarf strain called Norin 10. The result was a type of wheat that had the yields of the taller plant, but it was shorter and sturdier and it wouldn't crush itself. Next, he had to breed as much of this new Mexican dwarf wheat as fast as possible because the people needed to be fed as soon as possible. So he and his team invented what's called shuttle breeding, where you would grow one plant in two different places. They would plant the seeds in either Chapingo, which was high altitude in the south, or in the Yaqui Valley, which was low altitude in the north. After the plants matured, those with the highest yields and disease resistance were taken and harvested for their seeds. They were then taken and grown in the other location. If the crop was harvested in Chapingo, its seeds would be grown in the Yaqui Valley, and vice versa. The crops being grown in two distinct environments with different temperatures and altitudes and hours of sunlight led them to become stem rust resistant. Shuttle breeding combined with the new Mexican dwarf wheat multiplied Mexico's production of wheat threefold. For decades, if you were a farmer in Mexico, not having enough food would be practically a given. Yet, in 1956, Mexico became self-sufficient in wheat production. It was a miracle. Borlaug's analysis years earlier had been proven right. If we just applied the technology we had, we wouldn't have to go hungry. But the war against hunger was far from over. Population growth outpaced food production in India and Pakistan to the point that both countries were on the brink of famine. So Borlaug didn't stop at Mexico. He brought his revolution to Asia. In 1963, Borlaug was out touring a research plot in Pakistan. A director of the plot took him to their field test of the Mexican dwarf wheat that Borlaug had developed in Mexico. All the wheat was either stunted or dead. "They don't fit here," the director said. In the background, two young plant scientists stood trembling, quietly nervous about something. After the director left, they approached Borlaug. "We need to show you something," they said. "Meet us at the crack of dawn tomorrow." Tomorrow came, and the young scientists met with Borlaug and guided him to a distant, hidden part of the site. In Borlaug's words, "And there were 4 beautiful plots, about the width of this room and maybe twice as long, of the best 4 new dwarf Mexican varieties that were commercial in Mexico." They said, "There they are, you see how they fit?" And I said, "Why didn't you plant the nursery like that?" They said, "They wouldn't let us." What? Borlaug went back to the plot that the director had shown him of the failed dwarf wheat. He leaned in for a closer look, and he could tell that the plot had what he described as miserable weed control. He took a handful of the soil, and he realized it was completely dehydrated. He stepped back, and he realized there wasn't enough fertilizer. They let the Mexican wheat fail. They didn't take care of it on purpose. It was then that Borlaug realized that the starvation he had been at war with had an unintended ally: politics. If their indigenous agricultural programs weren't working, they sure as hell weren't going to let a foreign crop save the day. Borlaug remembered days where homeless children surrounded hotels begging not for money, but for scraps of bread. He remembered seeing a reality that is literally too graphic for me to describe on YouTube. Yet nonetheless, it was everyday life for these people. And he knew now that policy and pride were preventing the feeding of the people. He found that he was fighting political systems as much as crop disease. Borlaug called out bureaucrats for having a reckless disregard for human life. He confronted political establishments, shouting at officials who blocked the Mexican dwarf wheat. A second wind hit him. He managed to get the governments to purchase 450 tons of the seed. It was July, and the seeds needed to be planted by October. But the order was placed too late to ship straight from Mexico, so Borlaug arranged for 35 trucks to ship the seeds to a port in Los Angeles, but they were held up at the Mexican border. Then they were held up again at the American border. Then riots broke out in Los Angeles, which prevented the trucks from moving any further. Borlaug was on the phone for days straight until the seeds made it onto the port. It was August by then. When the seeds made it onto the ship, he went to bed. He woke to find that war between India and Pakistan had broken out. The war prevented the seeds from getting where they needed to be until after the month of October was over. Borlaug ordered the seeds be planted anyway. Then he found that the seeds were germinating at only half the usual rate. They'd been over-fumigated in Mexico. So he ordered the seeding rates to be doubled. On his quest to feed the starving, he faced roadblock after roadblock, most of which were caused by man, not nature. This no longer felt like a war against starvation itself. It also felt like a fight against the human forces that let it happen. But the investments into India and Pakistan were working. By 1966, they had become larger than any crop ever harvested in South Asia. By '68, Pakistan became self-sufficient in wheat production. A few years later, India did too. From the mid-60s to 70s, Indian and Pakistani wheat yields quadrupled. Food production finally outpaced the population. The people could eat at last. Borlaug was doubtlessly a hero of epic proportions by now. While traveling through India, seeing farm after farm filled with wheat, the former vice president of the Ford Foundation, Forrest Frank Hill, leaned over to Borlaug and praised him with the quote, "Enjoy this now, because nothing like it will ever happen to you again. Eventually, the naysayers and bureaucrats will choke you to death." On October 20th, 1970, Borlaug was out examining wheat on a distant Mexican field. He had saved hundreds of millions of lives by now, but he still remained relatively unknown to the public. And frankly, he preferred it that way. His wife's car pulled up. He thought she was an hour away, at least. She ran up to him. "Norman," she said, "you just won the Nobel Peace Prize." What? Borlaug had been at odds with major institutions for years now. They seemed to do nothing but stand in his way. But a Nobel Prize symbolized serious institution-level appreciation. It was a sign of respect. not the opposition that he had grown so used to. For decades, it seemed like the objective of feeding people had gone ignored. War, politics, even ego seemed to take precedence over the basic need of food, despite the fact that food is more fundamental an issue than politics ever could be. Finally, it seemed like agriculture was getting the spot in the cultural limelight that it needed. Borlaug was finally beginning to be seen as the hero that he was. On December 11th, 1970, Borlaug delivered his Nobel Peace Prize lecture. For the first time, all eyes were on the man who spent his career fighting hunger in the shadows. He'd have to choose his words carefully. He spoke of the success that came with the new Mexican dwarf wheat. Mexico had become self-sufficient in wheat production. The investments into India and Pakistan yielded an annual return of 750%. Both countries achieved self-sufficiency in wheat production too, despite many academics thinking that would never be possible. Perhaps since the dawn of agriculture itself, never before has the application of technology to the food process yielded such massive success in such a short period of time. The press had named the massive increase in cereal production the Green Revolution. He spoke of how the Green Revolution is often misinterpreted by those who know no better. Many thought that all crops benefited. Many thought that all farmers benefited. Many thought the Green Revolution would end world hunger. Some believed it already had. None of these are true, Borlaug said. Not all cereals had improved. Not all farmers had adopted the new technologies. Many couldn't afford to. Africa, in particular, still suffered intensely. In many parts of Africa, the effects of famine were visible everywhere. Entire communities struggled to survive, living in conditions so harsh that I'm not allowed to describe them. Children were severely malnourished, to the point that they were too weak to even cry. Borlaug would go on to say, "It is a sad fact on this earth at this late date that there are still two worlds, the privileged world and the forgotten world. The privileged world consists of the affluent, developed nations, comprising 25 to 30% of the world population, in which most of the people live in a luxury never before experienced by man outside the Garden of Eden. The forgotten world is made up primarily of the developing nations, where most of the people, comprising more than 50% of the total world population, live in poverty, with hunger as a constant companion and fear of famine a continual menace." He explained that the Green Revolution does not mean the same thing for the two different worlds. Giant surpluses are expected in the privileged world. We have so many grains that we can afford to fatten our animals on them. Our diet balances itself relatively naturally. Many of us have no idea how valuable the grains we take for granted are for the people in the forgotten world. We forget that food doesn't automatically spawn in the supermarket. In the forgotten world, 70 to 80% of the people are agriculturalists in one way or another. Many farm to feed themselves, but their land suffers, drained of nutrients. Their yields have teetered on the degree of starvation for centuries. Meat or proteins from animals are too scarce, too expensive for the vast majority of the population to obtain. Even those who don't starve are often severely malnourished because of an unbalanced diet. In fact, some critics say the Green Revolution did more harm than good. Borlaug perceived these critics as people from wealthy nations, people who've never gone hungry, people who condemned the act of feeding the hungry from comfortable office suites. He spoke of how scientists in the privileged world have abandoned agriculture for the sake of prestige, and how institutions have given these people a place to hide. In fact, some educational and research institutions restricted the amount of basic research its agricultural departments were permitted to do, no matter how important this research would be to feeding the starving. Worse yet, both the forgotten world and the privileged world spend more on weapons than they do on agricultural research. Both worlds spend more on destroying life rather than sustaining it. And it's been said that Borlaug's seeds demand fertilizer and an amount of water that many people can't afford. Many say Borlaug's work made farmers even poorer, increasing social and economic inequality. Worse still, Borlaug's crops require chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Reduced soil fertility, reduced genetic diversity, and erosion make the crops even more vulnerable. The political journalist Alexander Cockburn even wrote, "Aside from Kissinger, probably the biggest killer of all to have got the Peace Prize was Norman Borlaug. whose green revolution wheat strains led to the death of peasants by the million. Minute by minute, man's population grows. If there are more mouths to feed than the amount of food we have, people starve. If the amount of food we can produce collapses from crop vulnerability, everyone suffers. Food becomes less accessible both to people who can't afford it and even to people who can. Even people who think their world is too secure to collapse. Even people who've never known hunger will suffer. Even you and I. The larger the gap between food production and population size, the hungrier the world grows. And food has grown vulnerable. But that doesn't negate the fact that we have to feed the unfed. The answer is not to let the famished die. The answer is to figure out how to feed the world. And that's what infuriated Borlaug. The affluent academics and the prosperous institutions quietly suggested that we left places like Africa alone. How could we let that be the answer? Why can't we just invest more into agricultural research? Is it because we're too busy spending what we have on armaments? On new ways to kill each other tomorrow rather than to feed each other today? I understand the fear of the critics who wouldn't be afraid of the world going hungry. But the answer is not to give up on those who need it to ensure the security of those who don't. And Borlaug knew this better than anyone. He couldn't abandon Africa. But to do anything, he needed support. And with the world turning its back on him, could he get it? By 1980, denouncing the Green Revolution and the privileged world was the cool thing to do. Activists would campaign to the foundations that once supported Borlaug, saying that high-yield techniques would despoil the developing world. Environmentalists would say that inorganic fertilizers would starve developing nations, knowing nothing about the starvation these countries were already experiencing. Borlaug would go on to say that fear of green political pressure in Washington became the single biggest obstacle to feeding Africa. Western nations in the privileged world that were once donors stopped supplying fertilizer to Africa. Borlaug became a liability to the institutions that once hailed him a hero. He became an enemy to the world that once called him a champion. He'd go on to say, if they lived just 1 month amid the misery of the developing world, as I have for 50 years, they'd be crying out for tractors and fertilizer and irrigation canals and be outraged that fashionable elitists back home were trying to deny them these things. But the pressure was working. The foundations once set on feeding Africa turned a blind eye. Not even a Nobel laureate could garner support to feed a world where people died from its absence by the hour. Borlaug retired in 1979. He still did what he could, advocating, educating, researching. But he slowed down quite a bit by now. In 1981, he briefly came out of retirement to be the interim director of the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. Glenn Anderson, his good friend from his days of working in Mexico and the former director, had passed away. He's growing tired by now. Who wouldn't? He'd done his best. What more could you ask a man like him to do? The hushed pang of knowing what was happening in Africa never went away. But he'd done enough for the world. With quiet contentment, he'd passed down the torch of fighting hunger to the younger generation. The old warrior, pit against what felt like the entire world, had finally exhausted. But is this really where his story ends? What does that mean for Africa? It was 1984, and Borlaug was 71 when he met a philanthropic old man named Ryoichi Sasakawa. Sasakawa was a wealthy but generous man. He donated over $1.5 billion to charitable causes over the course of his lifetime, rivaling the amount that billionaires with 10 times his net worth donate over the course of theirs. And he was a humble man. He once described himself modestly as the world's richest fascist. Yes. He also happened to have been imprisoned as a suspected Class A war criminal after World War II, though he was never convicted. But nonetheless, he was in search of something noble. Yep, the self-proclaimed fascist who, in the very first page of his obituary, was described as a monster of egotism, greed, ruthless ambition, and political deviousness, was desperately in search for a Nobel Peace Prize. So he teamed up with Jimmy Carter and set his sights on feeding Africa. And he thought that the man for the job was Borlaug. But Borlaug was in his 70s now. He was tired. The man had done enough for the world. He declined the offer. He told Sasakawa, "I'm too old to start again." Sasakawa called back the next morning. He told Borlaug, "I'm 15 years older than you, so I guess we should have started yesterday. Let's start tomorrow." Borlaug thought about Mexico. He thought about Pakistan. He thought about India. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about what he said to him, that to succeed is to help the people who need it. He thought about the people of Africa, about how they were left to starve like the crew of a shipwreck on a remote island. He thought about those who lied to him, perpetuating the people's starvation. He thought about the privileged world that seemed satisfied with abandoning their forgotten brothers and sisters. Borlaug left for Ethiopia that year, then Ghana, then Nigeria, then Tanzania, then Togo. He went all over Africa, planting, researching, and feeding the people. Yields multiplied. Starving children experienced the sensation of fullness for the first time. Empty markets began to fill once again. The long-abandoned dream that one day there would be enough food to feed everyone began to seem possible. The affluent world could no longer stand in his way. The affluent world who knew nothing about the reality of famine. The affluent world that so easily deprioritized the other side of humanity. If not consciously, they embodied it in the way they lived, in what they valued. The academic butterflies they so desired delayed help that millions of people desperately needed. Fashionability prevented the feeding of populations that hadn't eaten in weeks, all because of one fundamental value. To the institutions, the academics, the advocates, success meant looking good. Success meant climbing to the top of the mountain of conventionality and shouting from its peak, even when these conventional values drifted so far from morality that the people who held them let the forgotten world agonize, to starve, all while remaining fully convinced that they were doing the right thing. People who think that success is to help the people who determine what success is are the people who let those who suffer remain forgotten. People who believe that what's fashionable is good even when preventing aid to starving worlds is what's fashionable. People who think that what's right is to help the people that don't really need it and to ignore the people that do. But Borlaug saw through this tendency. He lived his entire life in spite of it. He lived by his grandfather's code. To succeed is to help the people who need it, not the people who don't. If that meant being deemed a villain by the journalists who govern popular opinion, then so be it. If that meant battle with powerful institutions, with entire governments, then so be it. If that meant going to war with convention itself, then so be it. If you've made it this far into the video, I assume you admire or at least respect people like Borlaug. If that's true, I assume you're the kind of person who wants to see the world become a genuinely better place. A place where the well-fed help the starving. A place where we don't abandon those who suffer and convince ourselves it's the right thing to do. People like you, people who want the world to be better, people who support those who defy the standard to make things better. It is people like you who prioritize helping those who need it over following those who don't. If I'm right, I believe it is people like you that change the world. People like you. People like Borlaug, the hero who stood at odds with the privileged world his entire career to help those who truly needed it. Of course, you are your own person. Do what you think is right. Borlaug did. Borlaug passed away on September 12th, 2009. He was 95 years old. The last things he ever talked about was that the war on hunger wasn't over yet, that there was still more to do, still people to feed. Borlaug stands tall in the annals of history as the man who filled the bellies of those who've never experienced anything but hunger. The man who fought and defeated the naysayers who stood in the way of feeding the world. The hero who saved 1 billion lives.